Tonight, critical call. President Biden and President Putin get on the phone as Russia amasses troops on the border of Ukraine. The make-or-break talk ahead of a possible military offensive. And the Senate takes on the role of the Capitol Police during the January 6th insurrection.
I don't know if President Trump and I will ever see eye to eye on that day.
Plus, a former White House press secretary reveals several behind-the-scenes critical moments.
I went to the West Wing bathroom, the private bathroom there, and got on my knees and prayed.
On this day of infamy.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
80 years after Pearl Harbor. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation.
A high-stakes call with the potential to change the fate of a country. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm Jenna Browder.
Good evening. I'm John Jessup. President Biden and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, came face-to-face today in a virtual meeting, drawing the eyes of the world on an escalating regional conflict.
The critical conversation comes amid growing concerns that Moscow may be planning an attack on Ukraine. CBN News national security correspondent Caitlin Burke joins us now. Caitlin, what do we know about the call tonight?
Well, it lasted for just over 2 hours, and while a range of issues were discussed, the main topic was Ukraine. According to National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, President Biden was very direct and straightforward with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Biden was clear that the U.S. and our allies support Ukraine's sovereignty and will respond with harsh economic measures if Russia moves forward with an invasion. Sullivan stressed that these are measures that were not on the table in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. Now, a diplomatic solution is definitely preferred and is being pursued, but the White House believes Putin is still deciding how he wants to proceed. Some other consequences mentioned if Russia does not de-escalate include supplying provision and materials to Ukraine and deploying U.S. assets and capabilities to our NATO allies in the Baltic region. No information was given on Putin's side of the conversation or what demands he came into it with. But we do know that Biden did not make any commitments to Russia. Now, following his call with Putin, President Biden called the leaders of France, Germany, the UK, and Italy to brief them on the conversation and consult on the way forward. John and Jenna?
All right, Caitlin Burke, thank you very much. And here with us now, Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow and Director of Research in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Michael, we're glad to have you on with us this evening. First off, the broad strokes of this high-stakes video call. The two adversaries seen smiling in an image released by the Russian government, both leaders looking very stern in another photo released by the White House. The two spoke for about 2 hours, as Caitlin mentioned. What did you make of the virtual face-to-face?
I'm glad it happened because I think that knowing our own mind of what we would do if Russia invaded Ukraine and telling Putin what we would do is important for deterrence. There are plenty of times in our history we didn't figure out what we would do in a certain situation until after it had already happened. You know, think of when North Korea invaded South Korea or when Saddam invaded Kuwait. And this is not the way to prevent things. You want to have some sense of what you would do in advance. But I'm also glad that President Biden is not threatening a U.S. military response. Ukraine is not an American ally. We have enough places around the world where risking our own men and women in uniforms lives to defend freedom and defend allies. I don't think we need to add more to that list in military terms. But Putin should know we could not have business as usual if he invades Ukraine. There are going to be very high prices to pay. And I hope the kind of sanctions that we would consider would include in the financial sector, maybe even in the energy sector, trying to help Western Europe no longer depend as much on Russian gas and oil so they could cut that off if need be. And to me, this is the way to really make Putin realize that, you know, his economy has not been doing well based on sanctions that already are in place, and we can make him hurt a lot more. So I think the call served its major purpose.
Michael, a little bit of a two-part question here. First, how imminent or how dire a threat is a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine? And secondly, why is this flaring up now?
On the second point, it may be that, you know, Biden's been in office for a year. Mr. Putin's no longer of the opinion he can get along with, you know, a Donald Trump because they were sort of dancing around each other, trying to get along, but the Congress was still putting more sanctions on Russia even during the Trump presidency. That certainly continued under Biden. So maybe now he's sort of taken his stock of the situation, but it also may have more to do with immediate circumstances closer to home. I think President Zelensky of Ukraine has been asking NATO to bring Ukraine into the alliance throughout this year, and that's sort of brought the issue up in visibility. So that's my overall best guess. I think it has more to do with how Ukraine and Russia are interacting than with the United States. But, you know, in terms of what we can and should do about it, I just really think that we need to bear in mind the idea of a military response so far from the United States when we've already extended NATO 1,000 miles east after the Cold War. It just really isn't a job for our armed forces, I don't think. It's a job for our diplomacy, for our economic sanctions, but not really one we should be willing to risk American lives over. That's my view, and therefore I think we got to figure out some new concept for how we can agree with Russia that Ukraine will not come into NATO, but he will also keep his hands off Ukraine. And there'll be some kind of a new security architecture that really is about neutrality in this zone. And once that happens, some of the sanctions that we've already placed on Russia can be relaxed.
Hey, Michael, if Russia does invade Ukraine, what kind of message does that send to the rest of the world if Russia is not deterred here?
Well, there's two big things. If they nibble at a piece of it, that's more about messaging than it is about acquisition of land. And that's still very serious, obviously. We haven't had many cross-border conflicts in Europe since World War II. We don't want to start now. But the other possibility, and I've seen some writers discuss this, is that Russia would take literally half of Ukraine, all the way up to the main river that essentially divides the country in two, goes through Kiev. And the eastern part of Ukraine would then either become part of Russia or be cut off as a distinct country. That part of the Ukrainian population is a little more pro-Russian. They're less pro-Russian than they used to be, but they're still more pro-Russian than Western Ukraine. And maybe Putin would then secure all of his access to the Black Sea and feel like he could ensure that at least all of Ukraine would never be in NATO, even if part of it wound up in NATO. That's an extreme worst case. To me, that is very worrisome if it happens, but the chances are pretty small.
All right, Michael Hanlon with the Brookings Institution. Thank you so much. We always appreciate your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, turning now to investigations into the January 6th riot and are escalating on Capitol Hill. Today, the Inspector General of the Congressional Police Force telling senators in its current state the agency would not be able to withstand a similar attack on the Capitol.
This as lawmakers comb through key Trump administration players to identify who might have connections to inciting the riot. CBN's Brody Carter has been following this story and joins us now. Brody?
John, Jenna, USCP Inspector General Michael Bolton has overseen 8 reports trying to explain the force's performances and failures on January 6. His consistent conclusion and repeated response to the Senate Rules Committee. The department needs more training.
What happened on January 6th must never be allowed to happen again.
Lawmakers are looking for ways to strengthen U.S. Capitol Police after pro-Trump protesters stormed Congress. The violence on January 6 injured about 140 officers. One woman was shot and killed by police outside the House chamber. 4 officers also died by suicide in the days and months after the riot.
How many officers have left the department since January the 6th?
I don't have the exact numbers as far as those, but I believe it's been around 200 or so.
The Inspector General of U.S. Capitol Police testified Tuesday that a lack of training, emergency plans, and lack of intelligence data provided to congressional police led to this. Since that fateful day, Capitol Police have logged more than 700,000 hours of mandatory overtime, and congressional lawmakers have received more than 4,000 threats of violence, double the prior year. Bolton says they are understaffed and not prepared for another attack on the Capitol. Meantime, House committee members are hitting walls while investigating key Trump allies. Retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn and former U.S. Assistant Attorney General Jeffrey Clark will both likely plead the Fifth when questioned about overturning the 2020 election and who's responsible for the Capitol riots. Former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows surprised investigators by announcing he will refuse to cooperate with investigators. He had been expected to comply after Trump's former chief counselor, Steve Bannon, surrendered to the FBI on 2 counts of congressional contempt. His criminal trial is set for July.
It is our duty to honor those officers who have given their lives, but also ensuring the safety of all those working and visiting the Capitol complex.
As the investigation continues, some House GOP members are comparing the treatment of those arrested in the riot to that of prisoners of Guantanamo Bay.
They are told that their views are the views of cult members, even though these are men that every single night at 9 o'clock at night, they put their hand over their heart and sing the national anthem voluntarily.
The investigation will roll over into the new year, where the Senate Rules Committee will question the Capitol Police Chief next. John and Jenna?
Thank you. CBN's Brody Carter. Joining us now, CBN News Chief Political Analyst David Brody. David, we'll get to that bombshell Inspector General report that Brody was just reporting on in just a moment. But first, there's a potential deal on Capitol Hill, the debt ceiling. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell announcing today that Republicans are on board. Right now, that deadline to raise the debt limit is just in 8 days. David, do you think there's going to be enough votes to avoid a default?
Yes, 100%. As a matter of fact, there's a sense, right? Senator John Thune is in leadership, obviously Mitch McConnell as well, that they'll deliver 10 Republican votes at least. It'll probably be more, maybe 12, 13 or so, to make sure the debt ceiling gets raised. And this was really no surprise. I mean, you knew Republicans in the Senate were going to come through on this, and that's its more moderate body, if you will, especially among Republicans there in the Senate. So this is no surprise. And look, this is Republicans wanting to get this off the table and say, look, let's just raise the debt ceiling. We're going to still be okay in 2022. We're not going to really worry about backlash from our constituents about this. Yeah, there'll be a lot of folks that are frustrated at it, but you know, raising the debt ceiling is not a hill to die on, if you will, for some of the folks that are frustrated with Republicans and all the rhinos out there. So I think they'll be just fine.
David, the Inspector General of the Capitol Police says it would not be able to handle another attack on the Capitol building. That's the same force that protects the nation's lawmakers. Does that surprise you?
Well, it surprises me to a degree. I mean, there are over 120 recommendations, and I think only 30 or so have been implemented. I mean, so I think that should surprise us all and concern us all. I don't think there's any question about it. And I also think the question now has to be asked to Democrats and to say, wait a minute, you control the House, you control the Senate, you have more power for sure than Republicans do in Washington right now. Why indeed is this happening if the January 6th insurrection, the riot we hear all about is such a big deal? And by the way, it was. I'm not saying it wasn't, but if since it was, where is the follow-up? Why has this fallen through the cracks? And then again, it's Washington, D.C. We should not expect really anything less at this point. It's a lot of molasses, a lot of bureaucracy. So to a degree, it doesn't surprise me that much.
David, in a major reversal today, we learned former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows will not cooperate with the January 6th Commission. Does this have anything to do with his book, do you think?
Well, you know, I think that's going to be the kind of the initial speculation. But look, if you actually kind of go into the details of what Meadows' lawyer is saying here, in essence, he's saying, look, the head of the committee, the select committee, in essence, is kind of tipping his hand a little bit and making this very, very political by saying that if you plead the fifth, that you're, in essence, guilty of something. That's what Benny Johnson told Rachel Maddow the other day on MSNBC. And so all of a sudden, Mark Meadows' lawyer is saying, oh, hold on for a second. This seems like a setup. Oh, really? A setup? Really? You're figuring that out just now? But bottom line is Meadows is going to dial it back. So it seems like they're going to give the committee something, but maybe not everything.
Yeah, David, just a few seconds left here, but the trial date for former Trump aide Steve Bannon is set. He's charged with 2 counts of contempt of Congress. How likely is a Bannon conviction on the merits of this case?
Yeah, I'll give you about 15 seconds on this. The short answer is we really don't know, and here's why, Janet, because this is going to be played out in the court of public opinion. Steve Bannon now, through the discovery process in this trial, has thousands of documents with his lawyer and at his disposal. He wants to release those documents into the media. The media, ready for this, Jen and John? ABC, NBC, CBS, they are supporting Bannon. They want these documents released as well. So Bannon's going to play this out in the court of public opinion. That'll be interesting.
All right, David Brody, thank you so much.
Thanks, David.
You bet.
Coming up, the rising cases of COVID's Omicron variant and what to expect as the continuing global supply chain heads into Christmas.
Welcome back. Well, case numbers of COVID-19 are going up as more states detect the Omicron variant. The latest Omicron cases reported in Texas and Hawaii. COVID cases as a whole are now up in the U.S. by 27% in the last week. Pediatric virus infections are growing as well. 133,000 children testing positive just last week. The CDC is now urging people to use rapid tests before indoor gatherings, regardless of vaccination status.
Well, with Christmas around the corner and goods stalled in the global supply chain, Americans are wondering whether gifts will find their way under the tree in time. That was the focus of a congressional hearing today, examining the major delays and price increases stemming from the impacts of COVID-19 on shipping.
We truly are in uncharted waters. We've experienced localized port congestion in the past, but what we're seeing today is completely unprecedented. In the 60-plus years of containerized shipping, this is the first time that we have seen global supply chain congestion.
Witnesses pointed to the global pandemic and bottlenecks at ports and harbors, with congestion extending into trucks and railroads on land. Key indicators, though, hint the worst of the supply chain crisis is over and that inflation will cool off soon. When we come back, a behind-the-scenes peek at the Oval Office, as told by former White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany. Well, welcome back. Imagine this, holding a pacifier to a baby's lips with one hand while handling a call from the president on the other.
Yeah, for Kayleigh McEnany, that is not fiction. That was her reality, taking the job of press secretary as the mother of a 5-month-old at the time. That story and so much more revealed in her new book. Here's CBN's Abigail Robertson.
For almost a year, Kayleigh McEnany had a front row seat to some of the most high-stakes moments in our country's history. And for such a time as this, my faith journey through the White House and beyond, she takes readers along for the ride and describes how her faith in God carried her through.
I was one piece in what is a much bigger puzzle, and that's God's plan for all of us.
McEnany says relying on God was key to her success at the White House.
One of the things I did before the first time I took to the podium was talk to one of my predecessors, Sarah Sanders, and she sent me a list of advice, and one of them was, most importantly, pray.
Prayer played an important role ahead of her first briefing on May 1st, 2020.
Good afternoon. I have an announcement. I'm supposed to take to the podium at 2 p.m., but rather than walking to the podium, I'm in my office crying out of such nerves. Sarah had told me, most importantly, don't worry and pray, but I was indeed worrying.
So she turned to her faith.
And I went to the West Wing bathroom, the private bathroom there, and got on my knees and prayed. And Vice President Mike Pence went like this to me and said, I've been praying for you, which meant a whole lot. And I can tell you it was Christians like Sarah and the Vice President and Christians across the country who prayed for the administration that I think helped. I know that it helped the Trump administration along the way, and it certainly helped me, millions of Christians praying.
Praying with her team ahead of briefings soon became the norm.
You really were there at a historic time in our country. A lot happened. What was one of the hardest days that you went through?
I think one of the hardest days for me, it was certainly when the President of the United States got COVID-19. It was the most fearful I've been. It was extremely eerie to be in a White House in a West Wing without a commander-in-chief in the Oval Office.
Despite a resume that qualified her for the job, McEnany credits the Lord for leading her there.
I was brought to this position for such a time as this by Christ. I didn't make it there my own, and I want anyone reading this to know you are where you are, in a place, in a time, in a circumstance, in your body for such a time as this for a reason and a purpose. And if you ask Christ to guide you, he will take you to show you that plan he has for your life, just like he did for me.
McEnany's daughter, Blake, was just 5 months old when she started at the White House.
I learned how to hold a pacifier in my daughter's lips while fielding a call from the president and answering reporters in between in a rotating series of calls.
McEnany also shares how Trump reacted to constant negative media reports and the story that upset him most.
I can say without a doubt it's the Atlantic story. The president was in the middle of doing a rally, and this story comes out that says President Trump had called fallen military men and women suckers and losers. It was just categorically false.
Since leaving office, other former administration officials have written books sharing unflattering depictions of life inside the Trump White House.
It's very frustrating because it doesn't ring true to the person that I knew. Was he a tough boss? Certainly. He's the president of the United States. He's a businessman. You know, we know who President Trump is. So he demands, you know, the highest level of hard work from those around him. But he also is a father, a great family man, and someone who I grew to know and love.
If President Trump runs again in 2024, will you be a part of the campaign?
I never say never to anything, but I'd say it'd be hard to go back on the campaign trail. I hope to have more children by then. We'll see. But it would be hard to be a mom of many to be on the campaign trail. But I say the greatest honor, professionally speaking, of my life was getting the call to be press secretary and being asked to serve in public service at a high level in government is an honor. So, who knows if I was ever asked to do that again. It certainly was the high honor of a lifetime for sure.
McEnany says she doesn't know if former President Donald Trump will run again in 2024. Regardless, she believes the GOP is stronger and more united than ever before. Reporting from Virginia, Abigail Robertson, CBN News.
Finally tonight, remembering Pearl Harbor, this day marking 80 years since Japan attacked the small Hawaiian island, pulling the U.S. into World War II.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
More than 2,400 Americans lost their lives that Sunday. The surprise attack took out nearly half of the Pacific Fleet stationed at the U.S. Naval Base in Hawaii, as well as scores of aircraft.
And today, President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden laid hands on a wreath at the World War II Memorial here in Washington, D.C., paying tribute to veterans and honoring late Senator Bob Dole. The wreath contains a wild sunflower from the state of Kansas in honor of Dole. Bob Dole, who was seriously injured during World War II, he died Sunday at the age of 98.
You know, and he is largely tied to that World War II memorial. He had a lot to do with that, coming to D.C.
That is right, and also fighting for those who were disabled. Thank you so much for watching.
Have a great night.